Hi, and welcome to Creepy Crime Story, where the darkest truths aren't imagined. They're real. There was no screaming, no blood, no 911 call, just a quiet man, a locked door, and a wife who would never wake up. June 11th, 2025. Eternal Spring of Gilbert, an assisted living facility tucked into the Arizona suburbs, started its day like any other. Routine medication, dietary logs, and staff rotations documented by the hour. At 7:03 a.m., a CNA approached room 214 to deliver breakfast and conduct the standard morning vitals. The room was locked. That wasn't typical. By protocol, patient rooms in long-term dementia care were never to be locked, especially not overnight. But on this morning, the door was deadbolted from the inside. A staff key was used to enter. Inside, they found 60-year-old Danielle Crosby Davidson lying in bed, cold to the touch. Her husband, 46-year-old Justin Davidson, sat beside her. He said nothing at first, just stared. Her body was immediately assessed. The attending nurse noted cyanosis around the mouth and a faint bluish hue along the left side of her neck. Pupils fixed, unresponsive. The in-facility physician, Dr. Harlow, pronounced her dead at 7:19 a.m. No one called 911. Instead, per facility policy, internal management contacted the Gilbert Police Department due to unexpected death under unclear conditions. That phrasing triggered a mandatory investigation. Within the hour, detectives from Gilbert PD's Violent Crimes Unit arrived on scene. Body transport was delayed until they could photograph the scene and log items from the environment. It wasn't the usual geriatric fatality. There was no DNR order, no terminal condition officially documented. Danielle was diagnosed with advanced dementia, but she was stable, communicative at times, and had not been in distress prior to the night of June 10th. This was not expected, and certainly not explained. Danielle Crosby Davidson had been a resident at Eternal Spring since November 2024. A retired speech therapist with no prior psychiatric history, she had shown early signs of Alzheimer's in 2021. By mid-2024, her condition had progressed, and her husband had elected to place her in professional care, citing burnout and the need for 24-hour monitoring. Staff at the facility described Danielle as cooperative, sometimes forgetful, and often quiet. But she responded to music and recognized familiar voices. She still used a spoon. She still smiled when spoken to kindly. In short, she was not in a vegetative state. Justin Davidson had flown in from California on June 9th and checked in at 4:46 p.m. Surveillance confirmed he brought an overnight bag and signed the in-room guest waiver, normally used for family members staying overnight in end-of-life care situations. But Danielle was not in hospice. He told staff he planned to spend a couple of days just being with her. CNA records show he declined dinner assistance on June 10th, asking staff not to disturb them. One note from the evening shift nurse reads, Mr. Davidson requested privacy for the night, denied PM meds assistance, locked door after 9:01 p.m. Facility policy prohibits overnight guest lock-ins, but the overnight nurse, new to the floor, did not escalate the issue. In her log, she simply wrote, door locked, assumed consensual, no noise heard. Detectives noted inconsistencies almost immediately. The room was sterile. No spills, no broken items, no signs of struggle. But one item stood out, an opened prescription bottle of oxycodone prescribed for Danielle. It was empty. The bottle, originally filled 10 days prior, had been documented at 43 remaining pills as of June 9th. It now contained none. No explanation was recorded. A used drinking glass sat beside the bed. Powder residue was visible along the base. The bedding was slightly disturbed, tucked in on one side, not the other. The call button had not been used overnight. Detective Mara Collins led the initial walkthrough. Everything was too quiet, she later told internal logs. Clean, composed. Nothing that pointed to panic, but enough to feel like someone was controlling the scene. Justin sat in a visitor chair when detectives entered. He answered questions flatly without resistance. When asked when he'd last spoken to staff, he replied, last night, I said I didn't want her disturbed. He did not ask what had caused his wife's death. Danielle's body was transported to the Maricopa County Medical Examiner's office at 10:22 a.m. Autopsy intake began within the hour. The attending pathologist flagged the case as high priority due to the combination of elder death, locked room circumstances, and possible medication misuse. Staff interviews commenced that afternoon. 3 separate employees, including the overnight CNA and the floor nurse, confirmed that Justin had refused assistance repeatedly. One stated, "He was polite but firm, said he'd take care of everything that night." Another detail surfaced. 2 workers had attempted to check in around midnight due to a routine oxygen level audit. They knocked twice, no response. They didn't press further. At 2:37 a.m., hallway surveillance showed no movement into or out of room 214. The room remained undisturbed until the morning shift unlocked the door. Back at the station, Gilbert PD cross-referenced Danielle's medical file and flagged several anomalies. Her prescription refill request for oxycodone had been approved remotely by her primary physician on June 1st via patient portal, not unusual in chronic cases. But the dosage increase request, submitted June 5th, had been denied. Still, the bottle found was the higher strength, 10 millinorm, not the previously approved 5 millinorms. The question became, who obtained the new script, and why did no one at the facility flag the change? Detectives submitted the prescription number for trace analysis. In parallel, the forensic team sent the glass and residue swab for lab screening. A full tox panel was ordered for Danielle, with priority testing for opioids. By the close of June 11th, Danielle's death was officially classified as suspicious. No charges were filed, but a sealed internal report noted preliminary suspicion of chemical overdose, followed by asphyxiation indicators, pending further pathology. Justin Davidson was released from the facility voluntarily, but was informed he could not return without legal review. Gilbert PD's internal note, timestamped 7:46 p.m., reads, "Next steps dependent on autopsy tox. Prioritize interviews with prescribing physician and lab tox match on residue. Family not yet notified of suspicion." In forensic work, silence isn't just the absence of sound. It's often the first signal something was wrong. At Eternal Spring of Gilbert, what no one heard that night became the loudest red flag the next morning. By June 12th, less than 24 hours after Danielle Crosby Davidson was found unresponsive, the Gilbert Police Department had elevated the case classification from unexplained death to potential criminal incident pending toxicology. The shift was procedural but meaningful. It unlocked access to subpoenas, accelerated autopsy processing, and granted investigators a wider scope to evaluate facility-level failures. The lead forensic pathologist, Dr. Benjamin Mahoney, initiated an expedited full-panel toxicology screen at 9:12 a.m. He also requested histological analysis of subcutaneous tissue around the neck and internal organ samples. Preliminary external examination had already shown subtle bruising below the jawline and a non-standard lividity pattern inconsistent with natural cardiac arrest. Meanwhile, a parallel team from Gilbert PD combed through the facility's surveillance logs. Eternal Spring was equipped with hallway motion-activated cameras, but not in-room systems. The footage from June 10-11 confirmed no medical staff entered room 214 after 9:11 p.m., when the evening nurse made her last attempt to administer Danielle's nightly medications. The door had remained closed and locked until breached by staff the next morning. That log mattered. It provided a fixed time window, 9:11 p.m. to 7:03 a.m., a nearly 10-hour isolation period in a controlled medical environment. Detectives reviewed the building's keycard access records. Staff had used their assigned cards for routine rounds until 10:04 p.m. After that, room 214 was untouched. The card registered to Justin Davidson was logged once, upon entry at 4:46 p.m., June 10th. No secondary exit was recorded, confirming he remained inside through the night. At 11:42 a.m. on June 12th, Facility Director Carlene Huxley was interviewed. When asked if Justin had ever requested medication access for Danielle, she paused before answering. "He didn't request it from me directly, but I was under the impression he had her trust, figuratively and legally." That assumption proved costly. Eternal Springs protocol dictated that all medication administration required staff oversight. Even in the presence of family, controlled substances like oxycodone must be logged by a licensed caregiver. Danielle's medlog stopped cold after June 10th at 6:03 p.m. A single line read, "PM dose refused by visitor." That was irregular. The nurse who wrote the note, Sheila Navarro, later clarified, he didn't want her to take anything. Said she was sleeping fine and not in pain. He was not licensed to make that call. In cases of dementia, decisions about treatment must default to a designated medical power of attorney. Danielle's file named Justin as that party. However, the facility failed to verify whether any limitations had been placed on his authority. Later that afternoon, a small but crucial piece of evidence was retrieved. The glass collected from Danielle's bedside tested positive for opioid residue. Lab analysis confirmed trace amounts of oxycodone powder dissolved in a non-carbonated liquid. The concentration was consistent with crushed tablets, not pre-dose prescriptions. That data, combined with the sudden pill shortage and lack of administration logs, suggested a non-standard delivery of medication. Not just unsanctioned, but potentially lethal. Dr. Mahoney's early report, submitted at 4:26 p.m., cited cause of death as pending toxicology confirmation, but flagged suspected overdose with secondary positional asphyxia as likely contributors. He noted petechial hemorrhaging around the eyes and minor pulmonary congestion, both possible signs of oxygen deprivation. The phrasing was careful but pointed. Across town, Officer Lena Cho began reaching out to Danielle's previous physicians in California to request prescription history. One record from May 2025 stood out. A refill order for oxycodone had been approved under a different dosage strength than Danielle's current file indicated. That refill was picked up in California by Justin. This detail reframed the investigation's direction. If the medication used in Gilbert was not from the facility's pharmacy, but rather personally transported across state lines, the case moved into a new category: unregistered transport of controlled substances with fatal outcome. The Maricopa County Attorney's Office was briefed by 6:30 p.m. They requested sealed chain of custody documentation on all evidence collected and flagged the case for potential grand jury consideration. Inside the report, one line from Detective Collins stood out. The door was locked, the pills were missing, the staff was quiet, the body spoke the loudest. By June 13, 2025, the narrative forming around Danielle Crosby Davison's death no longer resembled a medical event. It was becoming a forensic case, and not a simple one. The toxicology report returned that morning from the Maricopa County Medical Examiner's Office. Danielle's blood tested positive for oxycodone at 640 mmol, well above the recognized lethal threshold for an adult with no history of opioid tolerance. The presence of metabolites in the liver and kidneys suggested ingestion occurred several hours prior to death. Aligning with the suspected overnight window of 9:30 p.m. to 2 a.m., the results didn't stop at confirming overdose. Lab notes highlighted particulate residue in the stomach, small, undissolved granules consistent with crushed, uncoated tablets. That detail shifted the incident from overdose to deliberate delivery. Pills were not swallowed whole. They had been broken down and administered, likely in liquid form. Investigators used the timeline from surveillance, the known prescription quantity, and Danielle's medical file to construct the window in which the overdose occurred. The absence of any EMR, electronic medical record entry, or documented staff-administered dose eliminated accidental misadministration. This wasn't an error. Someone had bypassed procedure. By the afternoon, Detective Collins received confirmation from CVS in San Luis Obispo County, California. A 10 milliliters oxycodone refill was filled on June 6th, 5 days before Danielle's death. The prescription had been picked up by Justin Davidson using a power of attorney authorization. Danielle's Arizona file, meanwhile, only reflected 5 milliliter dosages, and there was no record of that higher dosage bottle being transferred to the facility pharmacy. The pills never went through medical channels in Arizona. They arrived with him. That same day, Collins revisited room 214, this time accompanied by a forensic tech trained in luminol processing and trace compound detection. No blood, no struggle, but the drinking glass, previously tested for opioid residue, was swabbed again to assess volume and composition. Analysts determined it likely contained at least 6 crushed pills, based on particle density and concentration of sediment still present in the ridges. Combined with evidence from Danielle's gastrointestinal contents, The implication was now mathematical. Between 50 and 70 milligrams of pure oxycodone had been administered orally, most of it absorbed before death. Yet no vomit, no signs of seizure, no terminal restlessness were reported or observed by staff. That led to one conclusion: she was likely sedated in silence, possibly assisted by further means. At 5:18 p.m., an internal memo from Maricopa County read, "Concentration and distribution patterns inconsistent with self-administered oral intake. Combined with positional marks on cervical region, possible secondary mechanism is smothering." No accusations were made at this stage, but patterns were forming. Records from the facility's overnight log revealed one more detail. Danielle's call light had not been activated once throughout the night. For a patient still capable of mobility and response, that was abnormal. Interviews with other dementia patients on the floor confirmed that even low-functioning residents typically press the nurse call button once or twice overnight, usually for comfort or confusion. Danielle had done so almost nightly prior to June 10th. Not that night. Staff said she seemed calmer than usual during the day. That calm, in retrospect, might have been drug-induced. Detectives mapped the physical evidence against the electronic access logs. At 4:46 p.m. on June 10th, Justin Davidson entered the room. The door remained unopened until 7:03 a.m. June 11th, no food deliveries were accepted. No nurse was allowed entry. The room was silent on all hallway recordings. And yet, when asked about his final hours with Danielle, Justin allegedly stated, "She just slipped away. I held her hand until she stopped breathing." His demeanor during that interview was calm, no expression of panic, no mention of medical emergencies or calls for help. He had simply waited. That calmness became a point of internal discussion. One officer noted privately in their case log, "The data aligned too cleanly." Sometimes that was the problem. In the field of forensic pathology, the body rarely lies. It may withhold at first or present clean on the surface, but under tissue and pressure, under microscope and blade, it confesses. On June 14, 2025, the final histopathology results on Danielle Crosby Davidson were submitted to the Gilbert Police Department. The report came from the Maricopa County Medical Examiner's Office, and it shifted the investigation into full prosecutorial territory. The preliminary autopsy had noted bruising on the left side of the neck. What the lab confirmed was deeper: bilateral subcutaneous hemorrhaging, specifically around the sternocleidomastoid muscle and extending to the thyrohyoid membrane. These injuries were not caused by a fall. They were consistent with manual compression or smothering involving sustained external force. Not a pillow, but likely a human hand or dense fabric used with direct pressure. Along with the bruising, petechiae, pinpoint hemorrhages in the eyes, were found during the internal exam. Though not conclusive in isolation, when paired with cervical trauma and the oxycodone overdose already confirmed, they supported the conclusion of asphyxiation layered atop chemical sedation. Danielle hadn't just overdosed. She had stopped breathing due to combined central nervous system suppression and mechanical obstruction. And that obstruction wasn't spontaneous. The blood told that story plainly. At 9:17 a.m., the homicide unit met with Deputy Medical Examiner Dr. Mahoney to go over the histology slides. He laid out the timeline: ingestion within 2 to 4 hours prior to death, no sign of regurgitation, and zero muscular tension in the jaw or neck, both indicative of deep opioid sedation at the time of airway interference. She did not fight back. The analysis also clarified that the bruising pattern was uniform in direction, suggesting a downward angle from left to right, common in smothering when the assailant is positioned above the victim's left side. The hand size to bruise ratio, though not a precise science, was documented. It wasn't just what had been done, it was how long it had been sustained. The compression pattern required a sustained force of at least 90 seconds. In medical terms, that's intentional action, not reflex. The evidence now supported a dual mechanism cause of death: acute opioid toxicity combined with asphyxiation due to external airway obstruction. Across town, the facility administrator was placed under formal review. Licensing authorities demanded access to overnight records, visitor logs, and emergency response protocol. A recurring concern surfaced: The staff didn't intervene because they had no reason to believe something was wrong. The room had been quiet, too quiet. 2 days before Danielle's death, a report had noted her as restless during sundowning hours, a common dementia symptom marked by agitation in the evenings. But during her final night alive, there were no reports of movement, no sounds from the room, and no call button activated. For a dementia patient with a known pattern of restlessness, total silence was unnatural. That silence, combined with a locked door, restricted access, a cleared medication bottle, and now confirmed pressure trauma to the airway, formed a complete chain of forensic indicators. Detective Collins compiled the working case file. The evidence spoke louder than any witness. One glass with residue matching crushed oxycodone empty bottle confirmed to have come from California, not Arizona. 10 hours without staff contact, a bruising pattern indicative of direct, sustained compression. No involuntary signs of physical resistance. Elevated blood levels, positive for opioid and respiratory suppression. A body that had been rendered defenseless. The state's position, now under review by the Maricopa County Attorney's Office, was this. Danielle was chemically incapacitated and then physically silenced. From a legal standpoint, motive was secondary to method. But inside the homicide unit, there was a shared observation. The preparation wasn't frantic. It was systematic. The overdose didn't act fast enough. Something else finished it. In homicide cases involving vulnerable victims, intent is often murky, blurred by emotion, rationalization, or the illusion of mercy. But when forensic evidence speaks plainly, motive becomes an afterthought. Still, for the justice system to work, it must weigh not only what was done, but why it was done. By June 15, 2025, the Gilbert Police Department had completed its forensic assessment. The combination of toxic overdose and mechanical asphyxiation in the death of Danielle Crosby Davidson was no longer speculative. It was fact. But this case was not just forensic. It was also deeply personal. Detectives reached out to Danielle's adult daughter from a previous marriage. She lived in Colorado and had been estranged from Justin Davidson since 2021. In her statement, she described her mother as resilient, someone who had bad days with the dementia, but never gave up. She stated clearly that Danielle did not want to die, and that there had been no discussion within the family about end-of-life measures. This mattered. Arizona law permits limited forms of physician-assisted death, but only under very specific regulated conditions. Danielle had not signed any advance directive, nor had she been deemed terminal. Her condition was degenerative, not immediately life-ending, and more importantly, no healthcare professional had sanctioned the use of high-dose opioids beyond symptom relief. Records showed that the 10 milliliters oxycodone used in the fatal dose had been picked up in California, prescribed by a physician no longer affiliated with Danielle's case. The refill was legal, but the transport across state lines, the unreported administration, and the result were not. When asked to comment during a second voluntary interview, Justin said little. He acknowledged bringing the medication with him. He stated he didn't trust the staff to manage her comfort. That sentence was added to the file, word for word. Inside the homicide unit, the question shifted from how to why. What was he trying to do? Detective Collins reviewed a handwritten note found in Justin's personal belongings at a nearby hotel. It was not a suicide letter, nor an apology. It was a list. Pill count, timing, music playlist, clean clothes. The items were methodical, prepared. There was no indication of distress or second thoughts. That preparation, paired with his complete avoidance of emergency services during and after the incident, raised flags not just about cause, but about control. Danielle had not made any decision. She had not written, recorded, or verbally expressed a wish to die. There was no last directive, no video, no witness to consent. In legal terms, what mattered wasn't the emotional justification. It was the absence of her voice in the decision that ended her life. Prosecutors reviewed the totality of evidence. It met the standard for first-degree murder under Arizona Revised Statute, Paragraph 13, ALA 105. Intentional killing. Premeditation. Use of a controlled substance to facilitate the act. Victim unable to resist or consent due to mental incapacity. On June 17th, the Maricopa County Attorney's Office formally prepared a charge of first-degree murder against Justin Davidson. Some members of the public, following news coverage, described the case as complex, even tragic. But legally, it was not ambiguous. The law does not permit euthanasia by proxy. The law does not allow family members to decide when a vulnerable adult's life should end, especially in secret, especially through means that leave no room for defense or objection. In conversations around end-of-life care, society often wrestles with the line between mercy and harm. But what this case illustrated is that mercy cannot exist without consent. And in Danielle's case, that consent was never given. By June 20th, 2025, the evidence was no longer in motion. It had settled into form. The forensic timeline had held under scrutiny. Toxicology matched scene findings. Medical examiners had documented trauma. Statements had been gathered. The file was complete. In Arizona, first-degree murder charges require formal indictment by a grand jury unless waived. In this case, no waiver was offered. The Maricopa County Attorney's Office moved forward with impaneling. The presentation to the grand jury was methodical. It opened with foundational evidence. Danielle's medical state. A certified geriatric neurologist confirmed that despite her dementia, she retained limited autonomy and cognitive awareness. Enough at the very least to register discomfort. Enough to have used the call button if she'd been able. Next came the toxicology breakdown. Jurors were shown blood work levels with comparative baselines for tolerance. Danielle had not developed any prior resistance to opioids. The 60+ milligrams of oxycodone absorbed into her system were not prescribed, not monitored, and not survivable. Then came the histopathology slides. Using simple language, the state's forensic pathologist explained what the bruising meant. Pressure, sustained over time. Enough to cut off airflow. Enough to confirm that this wasn't an overdose alone. It was a layered mechanism, chemical and physical, delivered in sequence. The prosecutor then outlined the timeline. From the moment Justin Davidson entered room 214 at 4:46 p.m. on June 10th, no one else entered that space until the body was discovered at 7:03 a.m. on June 11th. 10 hours uninterrupted. Surveillance confirmed it. Keycard logs confirmed it. Staff testimony confirmed it. There was no 911 call, no panic, no visible request for help. According to the internal care logs, Danielle had been in stable condition the previous day. There were no changes in her medication regimen, no symptoms of deterioration, and no request, written or verbal, indicating she wished for her life to end. The state did not focus on motive. The law in this context did not require one. What mattered was that a vulnerable adult had died in a controlled environment under conditions that were preventable, traceable, and intentional. By Arizona statute, premeditation does not require long-term planning. It can be formed moments before an act is carried out, so long as the act was deliberate, not impulsive. The list found in Justin's travel bag, pill quantities, dosage timing, items to bring, was introduced as circumstantial evidence of planning. The absence of communication with staff during the critical overnight period further reinforced the theory that Danielle was deliberately isolated before the act. In under 3 hours, the grand jury returned a true bill, one count of first-degree murder with aggravating factors due to the victim's medical vulnerability and mental incapacity. The indictment was sealed for 24 hours. Justin Davidson, who had remained in Arizona under passive supervision, was arrested at a private residence in Chandler on June 21st at 6:42 p.m. without resistance. He was held on $1 million bail, booked at the Maricopa County Jail, and formally advised of the charges the next morning. Outside the courthouse, no press conference was held. The county attorney's office released a single written statement. Every person deserves dignity in life and in death. Our legal system exists to protect the most vulnerable, and we will honor that commitment in court. Once the indictment was handed down and Justin Davidson was in custody, the investigation moved into its next phase. Context. In violent crime cases, particularly those involving intimate partners, the forensic evidence often tells what happened. But the broader question of who this person is and why the outcome occurred depends on history. And in this case, the history was complex, but not invisible. Born in 1979 in Modesto, California, Justin Davidson held no felony record, no prior arrests, and no documented history of domestic violence. To most outside observers, he was a private, composed man, financially stable, with a clean civil background. He worked remotely in the tech sector and had no prior contact with Arizona law enforcement. But the absence of criminal history did not mean the absence of behavioral patterns. Following his arrest, Gilbert PD initiated a full lifestyle review. The goal wasn't to speculate motive, it was to map pattern. Through subpoenas, they pulled phone logs, financial records, and digital metadata from Justin's devices. The findings weren't explosive, but they were deliberate. In the weeks leading up to Danielle's death, his digital footprint showed no searches related to dementia care, palliative medicine, or grief counseling. Instead, there were online pharmacy lookups, cross-state travel planning. Notebooks in his possession reflected meal planning for the stay in Arizona, but made no mention of coordination with staff. It was a trip designed around autonomy, not collaboration. Investigators also reviewed a prior civil case from 2017 in which Justin had contested a conservatorship arrangement involving an elderly uncle. The court denied his petition, citing concerns that the petitioner sought to bypass formal medical review in favor of subjective personal judgment. Though never escalated to abuse allegations, the documentation added texture to a behavioral profile, one that leaned toward control in caregiving settings. Professionally, colleagues described him as detail-oriented, intense, and inflexible. One HR evaluation from 2023 noted a tendency toward unilateral decision-making and avoidance of team input. From a behavioral standpoint, the concern was not that Justin had suddenly snapped. It was that he had arrived at a decision independently and carried it out without disclosure, challenge, or oversight. Post-arrest, Justin did not request media contact. He waived his right to speak at his bail hearing and declined all interviews. His attorney entered a plea of not guilty, pending full discovery. But internally, law enforcement flagged his emotional flatness as notable. No visible panic during his wife's death. No attempt to reach out to family. No effort to conceal his actions, but no acknowledgement of wrongdoing either. It was control, not concealment, that defined the act. That distinction mattered. This was not a crime of passion, nor of spontaneous violence. It was an event structured by a singular belief that he alone understood what was best for his wife, and that belief, applied in silence and without resistance, had ended a human life. Cases like this, intimate, quiet, technically methodical, challenge the traditional model of malice. They force courts and communities to reckon with a harder reality, that violence doesn't always look violent. It doesn't always scream. Sometimes it simply decides. And when a decision replaces consent, it's no longer care. It's control masquerading as compassion. The final autopsy report on Danielle Crosby Davidson arrived with no poetry, no ambiguity, and no space left for fantasy. Her cause of death was listed as asphyxiation, with high concentrations of oxycodone and lorazepam found in her system. Two medications she was never prescribed in those quantities, and which her body, already weakened by Alzheimer's, couldn't have metabolized fast enough to fight back. The forensic pathologist noted petechial hemorrhaging in the eyes and ligature pressure consistent with manual airway obstruction. There were no defensive wounds, no signs of struggle. Danielle had been incapacitated, silenced, and left to die under circumstances her husband would later try to frame as mercy. But evidence told a colder story, one of premeditation and control, not compassion. Justin Davidson was arrested at his Chandler, Arizona home on the evening of June 13, 2025. He did not resist. Officers described the scene as surreal. Davidson appeared calm, even composed, with an overnight bag already packed and his papers neatly stacked on the kitchen counter. In the weeks that followed, investigators mapped a timeline of digital searches, altered facility records, and subtle, deliberate behavior that painted the picture of a man who had engineered the death of his wife and tried to pass it off as an act of love. On May 28th, just 2 weeks before Danielle's death, Justin had searched for how long it would take to suffocate a person in deep sleep. That same day, he placed an online order for high-dose sleep aids and later accessed Danielle's prescription portal to refill her pain medication outside of routine nurse approval. There were no alerts flagged because the system still recognized Justin as an emergency contact. On June 7th, he disabled the smart camera in her care suite, claiming to staff she'd grown paranoid about being watched. From that moment, the visual record went dark. The camera feed did not resume until after her death. What happened on the night of June 10th is partially reconstructed from timestamps, facility logs, and trace evidence. Justin arrived at Eternal Spring around 6:10 p.m., bringing what he told staff was dinner and flowers. The flowers were artificial lilies. The dinner was never opened. He remained in the suite for over 8 hours without interruption. Overnight staff did not perform a single in-room check between 9:30 p.m. and 6:45 a.m., despite protocol requiring high-risk dementia patients be monitored every 2 hours. When Danielle was discovered at 6:48 a.m., her vitals were gone. Her body was warm but unresponsive. No nurse on duty attempted resuscitation. Her time of death was estimated between midnight and 2 hours a.m. Justin's version of events collapsed quickly. He initially claimed Danielle had begged for release, that she had lucidly asked him to help her die, and that he had honored her wish. But no such request had been documented. There was no medical directive, no living will, no DNR order. Danielle had worked for years in hospice administration. She understood end-of-life planning intimately. If she had wanted out, she would have done it on paper. Her silence was not permission. It was the effect of drugs she did not consent to. The lead prosecutor made that point plainly at the bond hearing. He muted her to avoid a refusal. Legal proceedings moved fast. Justin was charged with first-degree murder, unlawful administration of controlled substances, and tampering with evidence. His attorneys attempted to reframe the narrative, arguing diminished capacity, emotional exhaustion, and prolonged psychological trauma from watching his wife deteriorate. They floated the idea of reducing charges to second-degree murder or even manslaughter. But the prosecution, armed with forensic timelines, refused to consider any deal that did not include a guilty plea to intentional homicide. Bail was denied. Outside the courtroom, fallout spread quietly but forcefully. The care facility launched an internal audit. Staff schedules showed multiple gaps in overnight supervision. The nurse who failed to check on Danielle was placed on administrative leave. Eternal Spring issued a statement acknowledging procedural failures and promising policy reform, but no criminal charges were filed against the staff. Meanwhile, advocacy groups for elder rights seized on the case as a chilling example of what happens when end-of-life control slips into personal judgment. Opinion pieces began appearing across local media, warning against what one journalist called compassionate coercion masquerading as care. Danielle became a symbol, not just of a failed system, but of how vulnerable people can become invisible even in plain sight. Justin remained behind bars as of July 6, 2025, awaiting trial. Prosecutors have not confirmed whether they will seek the maximum penalty, but internal memos suggest they view the case as precedent-setting. Danielle's family has not spoken publicly. Her son from a previous marriage issued only one written statement. "My mother deserves safety, dignity, and time. She was denied all three." Her headstone, paid for by distant relatives in Minnesota, bears only her name, dates, and the phrase "she remembered for us when we could not." What makes this case unforgettable is not just how Danielle died, but how her death was framed, softened, and nearly rewritten into a moral story that never belonged to her. It wasn't assisted death. It wasn't mercy. It was a decision made by someone who had stopped seeing her as a person and started seeing her as a burden. In the end, the most haunting truth is also the most quiet. There was no goodbye, no last word, no consent, just silence, and a narrative overwritten by the one who survived. I've told this story not just to lay out the facts, but to remind you of something much deeper. When we stop seeing vulnerable people as fully human, when we silence them in the name of convenience or control, we all lose something essential. Danielle Crosby Davidson deserved better. And if her story taught me anything, it's that dignity must never be optional, even in the quietest corners of suffering. What do you think makes a life worth protecting? Have you ever seen someone's voice erased under the weight of someone else's power? Let's talk about it in the comments. If this story moved you or even made you uncomfortable, tell me where you're watching from or what part of the story stayed with you the most. And if you didn't connect with it, I'd love to hear why. If you found this video meaningful, subscribe to the channel so you don't miss the next case. Your voice matters here.